The time for action is now, said NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte in a speech in Berlin on the alliance's top priorities. He called on Europeans to keep supporting Ukraine, but he also criticized many of them for still being too complacent. And he called on the Europeans to defend the European way of life. Now, his speech comes at a crucial point in time for transatlantic relations, just days after the US published its new national security strategy. And I had the opportunity to discuss this document and other issues with one of Germany's top security experts and Mark Rutte's host here in Berlin, Ambassador Wolfgang Ischinger. Ambassador Ischinger, thank you very much for joining us. You spoke to Mark Rutte on stage just now and asked him how close we are to seeing Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine end before Christmas. How satisfied were you with his answer to that question?
Well, I have actually tended to believe for many, many months that I had not ever seen any sign of a willingness to compromise by the Russian side, which is why I've belonged to the school of skeptics about an early end to this war. But I have to admit, I'm listening not only to Mark Rutte, I'm listening to what Chancellor Merz had to say, what Americans are saying. We do see a very intense diplomacy going on today, yesterday, in coming days, this coming weekend. In other words, maybe this intense movement will actually produce some solution to the really crucial question. I think there are two crucial questions. The one is the territorial question. In a question of war and peace, that's always a fundamental question. What about territory? What belongs to whom, etc.? Who gets what? The other question is, of course, the really quite intractable question of security guarantees. And we know, I think we do know, that security guarantees that somebody puts on paper are probably worth the paper they're written on, but not much more. In other words, how do you fill that with meaning, with value for those who wish to be protected by that security guarantee?
And let's just assume that some sort of a deal is agreed, because we all know that Donald Trump has a very big interest. There are lots of people who are saying we need Donald Trump to have this victory as well, very influential figures. Let's just assume that a deal is made. Just how fragile is that European unity then, if the impression then gets spread across Europe that war in Ukraine is over? Mark Rutte spoke of the risk of too many Europeans still too complacent. He said, we are Putin's next target, but many are complacent. Isn't there, as cynical as that may sound, that risk if there is a ceasefire in Ukraine?
Oh, absolutely. I would be the first to agree. In fact, I would even go a step further. As long as this may sound overly cynical, so beware. But as long as this war is being fought, vigilantly and courageously by our Ukrainian friends, Europe is safe. Europe is safe because the Ukrainians have successfully tied down this mighty Russian army for years now in an incredibly sustained fight defending their own country. The moment this war ends, the moment weapons are silent in Donbass, etc., and over Ukraine, Russia will have all the time, Russia stretches over 10 or 11 time zones. They will have all the time in the world to regroup, to rebuild, to spend even more money. In other words, we need not only be clear that once this war ends, our effort to become capable of defending Europe doesn't end. It actually starts seriously then. So far, the Ukrainians carry the burden. Once the war ends, we will have to carry a much larger share of that burden. In other words, I would go even a step further than Mark Rutte has just put it very brilliantly.
You say Mark Rutte has put it brilliantly. I just wonder whether, isn't there an inherent risk if the focus is so much on Russia, Vladimir Putin as the big threat to get the Europeans to do more for their own security? My impression was that there was very little focus on the threats coming from the US administration, or would you disagree?
Well, I think that is a very different kind of challenge. The challenge that we are facing from the United States is not really a security challenge. As the Secretary General correctly put it, this security strategy document says specifically and repeatedly that Europe is important for the United States, and it does not speak, doesn't even mention the possibility of the US leaving NATO, or I mean these were questions intensely debated even during the first Trump administration, if you recall. So what we're currently facing is more an ideological challenge by certain elements now represented in the Trump administration who would rather see a bunch of European countries separate and national and sharing the, can I call it that, the MAGA ideology, clamping down on migration, upholding more traditional, so-called more traditional values. I find it, interesting, almost funny, that the reaction from Russia was, these are our values. I think that is a fundamental misunderstanding, but it tells us how confusing and how confused some of the minds are and how confused the discussion is. I think that if the MAGA movement that supports Trump so much, if they believe that parties like the German AfD, for example, are their perfect partners because they share some of these societal values, maybe they have not yet sufficiently looked at the fact that the AfD party is surely not a pro-American party. It has a history of being rather anti-American and pro-Russian. So if I were an American advisor, I would say beware of the AfD, not our friend. But this needs to be cleared up. In other words, we have quite a struggle in front of us to deal with this question of what kind of society are we interested in having. And I think that we have very, very good arguments in Europe to defend our idea of Europe. We have every reason to remind Americans that the idea of Europe was to make sure that the United States would not ever again be called into military action to end a conflict between members of what is now the European Community or the European Union. In other words, the European Union was not built, as Donald Trump has put it, to do damage to the economic interests of the United States. The founding principle of the European Union, and that is, I think, what we need to uphold, is that the European Union has a mission to make sure that the United States does not need to intervene once again, which is what they had to do in World War I, what they had to do in World War II, and so many hundreds of thousands of American lives were lost for that purpose. Never again.
European unity and cohesion is something, of course, that is not something that Donald Trump in that new White House document seems to favor. Are you aware of a longer version of the national security strategy? Allegedly, there is a paragraph in a separate document that essentially takes countries like Austria, Poland, Hungary, and Italy, where the US is saying we need to find a way of luring them away from the European Union. Does such a document exist? Are you aware of that?
I'm not aware of the document. I've seen the press reports hinting at such phrases. My answer, let's assume there is such an idea, such a plan. My response to that would be, well, good luck. We have one example where that was tried. That's called Brexit. And I know not a single of my British friends who will not now say we made a big mistake. So if these guys want to leave the EU, they should take a very, very good look at what happened to the growth, to the prosperity, to the well-being of our friends in the United Kingdom. I think that is that would have, if they take a close look, a deterrent effect that will make sure that they will not make that mistake of leaving the European Union, which is their guarantor of stability and prosperity and unity going forward.
I would like to ask you about the main event of the Munich Security Conference that's coming up in mid-February again next year. Of course, this year's edition made huge headlines because US Vice President J.D. Vance took to the stage attacking liberal European democracies. Can you share with us who is going to represent the United States at next year's edition?
I could not have told you a year ago who will represent the US. We have had, for the last 10 years, even more, we have had a tradition of the Vice President of the United States coming to Munich each year. The first one was in 2009, a gentleman by the name of Joe Biden, who was then the Vice President, and we've had the Vice President ever since. So I would hope that the United States would want to continue that tradition, but I don't know that. I'm sure that for security reasons, the public will be told, and we will be told, only very late in the game of who exactly and at what time of day will show up in Munich. What I do know is that we are expecting a very large, significant congressional delegation. I believe that we will be having 20, 25, maybe even more as members of the US Senate. And that is, of course, in and of itself, exceedingly important.
A lot of things are becoming thinkable now that didn't used to be thinkable. I would like to ask you about the discussion around nuclear protection for Germany. Because, of course, at the moment it's not legal for Germany to own their own nuclear weapons. Do you think that we are going to get such a discussion whether Germany should have access to its own nuclear weapons given everything that's going on?
I think that would be a foolish discussion. I'm against it. I've always been against it. And I don't think we need it. We have, and we continue to have, even if there are some doubts about America's role in NATO, etc. As we speak, there are American nuclear weapons in Germany and in other countries. As we speak, Germany has just ordered modern F-35 airplanes a couple of years ago, which will be delivered in coming months or years. As we speak, there's still tens of thousands of US troops in Germany and certainly in other European countries, adding up to more than 80,000 currently. In other words, I see at this moment no desire, no plan, and no concern about the United States really abandoning this role. And quite frankly, I have been an advocate for a long time of responding to the American question of why can't you guys do more about your own defense. I've been an advocate of responding positively to Emmanuel Macron's offer to discuss with his European allies, including first and foremost Germany, whether there is a possibility, and if so, to what extent and how, of using the French nuclear component to protect not only the territory of France, but in a larger sense, the European space. I think it's in this direction that our discussion should go. We have one nuclear capable member country in the EU, and we certainly have a very strong nuclear capable country among the European members of NATO, that's the United Kingdom. In other words, we have plenty of nuclear weapons that can be used for the purpose of making sure that not only France and the UK are adequately protected, but that Europe is better protected. And I think that's where I would start working with France, with the United Kingdom, and certainly to make sure that the United States will stay there. Then we don't need a German nuclear weapon. Look, the idea of preventing further proliferation around the world is a very important idea. And if a country like Germany, with our history and with our size, if we start even thinking about acquiring nuclear weapons, why would anyone think that the Saudis and many other countries around the world would not then also want to follow suit and acquire nuclear weapons? That would be the end of nuclear non-proliferation. So I think we need to demonstrate that we are good global citizens, that we're not in the business of acquiring nuclear weapons of our own, but that we are interested in having adequate protection by our friends and allies. And I think that can be done.
And just one very last question, that is a optimist, pessimist sort of a question. What's the status of the Transatlantic Alliance?
Well, quite frankly, I've been engaged in transatlantic issues now for practically 50 years. I've seen ups and downs. This is not an up moment. This is a difficult moment, surely. And I don't think that this difficult moment will end before the end of the Trump presidency. We will have continued friction. But that is the art of diplomacy, how to make sure that even if we have major differences of view, to make sure that on the principles, on the fundamentals, we are still aligned and we're together, and that there will be a continued deterrence effect to the other guys, those whom we want to keep from starting yet another, aggressive adventure in the East or in Central or in the South of Ischinger, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Pleasure.